What's the most bizarre coincidence you've ever personally experienced? I have this annoyingly strong crush that I fantasize about all the time. Not as much as I used to. I was on a walk thinking about this crush. See a page in a push. Pick it up. It's from a notebook. A conversation where they tried to date other people and it didn't work out because no one was like them, so they'd like to see each other. I convinced myself the universe was pushing us together for a reason. He'd lent me a book, so when I finished it I put the page in the book as a bookmark. Don't know if he ever noticed it. I didn't think my hints were too subtle. One night a friend and I were walking back to his house from another friend's house down the street. It started pouring rain, and we heard thunder in the distance. I said to him, I'm gonna start running back. I don't want to get soaking wet. He replied with, I'm not running unless lightning strikes right there, as he points his finger to the telephone pole in front of us. Lightning struck the pole. It was terrifying, loud, and the closest thing I've ever had to a supernatural experience. We started screaming, holy shit, holy shit, holy shit, and ran to his house. Not me. My mum, a family friend, went on a cruise and met her doppelganger. He was absolutely floored by their resemblance. She was from Queens. Years later, we happened to go there. Not one, but two taxi drivers started freaking out because one of their regulars is my mum's identical twin. I know it was the same lady. I can feel it in my nuggets. Even weirder, a lot of my mum's family is from New York City and got disconnected after my grandmother was left. At bakery was sent to an orphanage. I still wonder if they are possibly distantly related. I was visiting the Toys R Us in Times Square. We were traveling to the bottom floor via the escalator. That first step off of an escalator as the stair melts into the ground tends to freak me out and fascinates me, so I was staring at my feet. As I walked off I almost bumped into a group of people walking by. I knew the entire bunch. They were all customers at the bar I worked in Virginia Beach, VA. It wasn't like I saw out-of-state people. I nearly almost bowled them over. This happened almost 20 years ago, and we still talk about it. I was the MC of an English speech competition here in Tokyo. The speakers were junior high school kids from around the country. The contest winner was a student from Niigata, a few hundred kilometers to the northwest. I met him personally during an interview after the event. 2 months later, my wife and I were on vacation in Hawaii touring the Pearl Harbor site. As I excused myself to go to the restroom, a group of Japanese teens were coming out. One of them was the contest winner I had met earlier. Talk about a crazy coincidence. When I was a little boy, our next-door neighbor was an old man and occasionally his granddaughter would visit him. A little blonde girl about my age. Never paid attention to her. When I was about 10 we moved and my upstairs neighbor was an old lady and occasionally his granddaughter. A blonde girl would visit her. Never paid much attention to her. When I was in my teens we moved again and in my school my locker was right next to an attractive blonde girl. About my age. We are married now, in our 30s, and have children. I'm from southern Indiana. The summer between 8th and 9th grade. My dad brought me to Vegas on vacation and we stayed at Circus. Was playing in the arcade and spotted a friend from school also on vacation with his family. We played through and destroyed House of the Dead to with a crowd of people watching around us, rooting us on. It was probably the most fun I'd ever had up to that point of my life. I felt like the coolest kid. That arcade and atmosphere was incredible for a couple kids from a small Indiana town. I was walking back to my office from the cafe in my corporate complex, and I grabbed my phone and called my sister. It was a Tuesday at 10:00 a.m. I randomly chose to call her on her landline. As it was ringing, I had another call come in. It was my sister from her cell phone. I figured she saw me call, and for some reason, called me back via cell. She was not home. She was 50 miles away, calling me about some issue with our parents. Both calls were random, but we called each other at the same exact time. It was weird. I got a new co-worker about a week ago. He's 10 years older than me. We were chatting and he asks where I went to high school. I said I went to high school name. And he goes, oh yeah, I bought my first house near there. What year did you graduate? I tell him 2001. He says he moved into his house in 1998. Then we figure out he lived for houses down from me on the same street. This is in Phoenix. This metro area has like 7 million people. We work a good 30 miles away in a different area. It's honestly not that bizarre. But I'm a big hiker and was hiking on the ad. I camped at the shelter, and there were some other people around. We spent the evening hanging out and chatting. We even hiked together some the next day. Like 3 weeks later, I was back in my hometown driving down the road. I saw a group of hikers looking for a ride. Lo and behold, it was the same group of people we camped with weeks ago. It's just funny because what are the odds of running into them again off the trail? I went to a little seaside hotel that had DVDs you could borrow in the lobby. I grabbed a Dirty Dancing and The Princess Bride. When I got to my room, I discovered the DVD in the Dirty Dancing case was not the movie I picked. It was The Princess Bride. I opened Princess Bride and found the Dirty Dancing DVD. I hadn't opened either case in the lobby. There was no indication the movies were swapped. I just happened to grab two movies that someone else had borrowed and accidentally swapped. A few years back I got into a bad accident during a winter storm like 45 minutes away from my house. The responding officer, who let me sit in his car while I was waiting for my ride, looked at my license and says, "Do you have a big white dog?" I was shaken up and now confused because WTF, how did he know? We had never met. Turns out he was my neighbor on the street behind me. My dog used to escape the yard and go visit his dog. I had only ever spoken with his wife. Edited, I forgot my own story. When we were kids, my husband and I lived in 5 different towns across the country at the same time. And every time, we crossed paths or just missed seeing each other. But we never actually met each other until we were adults and met at my co-worker's house party. 2 examples. In one town, he lived around the corner and remembers seeing my dad's car parked out the front of our house. And in another, his dad did his teacher training at my school. He went to see the school play I was in. My mum has this friend that she's been best friends with since they met in kindergarten. You know how when someone is on your mind a lot, then suddenly you hear from them when it's not common to. That happened with them all the time. One time my mum picked up the phone to call her friend because she'd been on her mind a lot. She hadn't even dialed yet and she looked puzzled and said hello. Her friend had called her and my mum picked up the phone before it even had a chance to ring. My mum and her twin sister were both adopted to different families at birth. Unknowingly, their adopted families gave them the same name, but different spellings. The story doesn't end there, however, because the men they married and who later introduced the sisters were cousins. More crazy is that they have a half-sister who was also adopted at birth, and my mum and her lived across the back lane from one another and played together as kids, without knowing they were related. I was fly fishing in a lonely creek one day. Never noticed anyone else. Name it on focusing in the fishing. I rear back my fly rod, which had an extremely small hook 20 on it. Something felt wrong, and my cast failed. Looked back, and someone was indeed there, also casting another 20 hook from about 35 feet away, and we had managed to hook each other's flies mid-cast. The statistical probability boggles my mind. You'd have a better chance of winning the lottery in that scenario. Moved from Minnesota to Washington, met to separate people who had known my parents before I was born. Heck, before my parents had married. One of them even knew my dad died. Another person who I had known from Los Angeles area who moved to Minnesota at some point. I never saw him there, but he made his way out here to Washington after I did. And when he saw me, he knew me and was like, "Haven't seen you since we were kids." By the way I talked, I apparently talk like my dad. One time I was browsing Reddit and saw an article about feeding tubes. Decided to quickly glance through, having absolutely no reason to learn anything about feeding tubes at the time. Also, I thought. Turns out the next day, a very close family member needed to schedule to have one put in, and I knew exactly the procedure and words meanings they were using. The rest of my family thought I was a genius or something. I was also very surprised at how handy a random post became. When I was in high school, my family took a trip to New York City for the first and only time. Leighton Museum of Art walking through some exhibit or other, when we gradually realized these people standing next to us were our old neighbors, who had lived up the street from us for at least 10 years. They'd moved away not to NYC, so we hadn't seen them in several years. They also just happened to be on a family trip to NYC. Never saw them again after that. My family was in Disney World and we'd split up to catch the boat tram something. My brother and dad met back up with us and said, "We just saw the crazy neighbors from home in New Jersey." My mum refused to believe them since this would be a typical dad joke, and my brother bet her a Game Boy that no, they really saw the crazy neighbors. My brother won his Game Boy and we got back home, and it was confirmed by another neighbor who had been pet sitting for the loonies. I was looking through some high school graduation trip pics that my wife took when she was 17. It was her senior trip in Mexico. Huge party, and there I was. She took a pic of her best friend and I was right next to her. This was months before we met in college. We grew up hundreds of miles apart. We had been together for almost 10 years by the time I spotted this pic. She randomly took a pic, old school film of her future husband in a rave in Mexico. Consecutive relationships of mine accidentally started on the same date. Different years, January 5th, so we celebrated that day as our anniversary in both relationships, which lasted 2 years. Weird. Anyways, my current partner and I have many parallel life experiences, as well as having a birthday exactly 6 months apart from my previous relationship, date-wise, not age-wise. So strange. I've tried not to think of it too much, haha. Freaks me out a little.